All right, folks, North America time. If you haven't been excited in the class thus far, that's your fault. But I don't blame you, because introductions can be a bit boring. So now that we're going to be talking about regions from here on out, I expected the course to be a lot more educating and a lot more entertaining for you. Now to start with North America, here's a picture of Mary's Rock in Shenandoah, Virginia that I took over the summer. You can see this is part of the Appalachian Mountains. And I include this image because I want you to see that this mountain range is more rounded and a bit more docile than what we'll see out of the Rocky Mountains, which are these more jagged peaks, if you will. So keep this in mind when I begin to show you the rest of the pictures to describe the physical geography of that of the United States. Now Mary's Rock, Shenandoah, Virginia, this is the eastern part of the United States for those of you who are perhaps one step behind at this point, but get your cut up. This is North America Part 1, where I outlined the 50 states, the 16 odd territories of the United States, 5 of which we would focus on being places like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. But the United States' physical geography is characterized by 2 mountain ranges, the Appalachians being in the east, which I just showed you a picture from what you'd see in Virginia there, from Mary's Rock in Shenandoah, and then the Rocky Mountains that continue, the western part of the United States, and continue up into Canada. In the middle part, you'll see this country would be low-lying areas, which we largely used for agriculture in this country, what we'll refer to over and over again as the breadbasket of the United States. Now Canada, 10 provinces, they go in rows such as this, and 3 territories that are found in the northern portion of the country. Now those Rocky Mountains from the United States continue up into Canada in the western part of the country. And however, those Appalachian Mountains do die off in the northern part of the United States and do taper off into lower lying areas there in southeastern Canada. Much of the northern portion of the country of Canada is characterized by subarctic and tundra-like conditions. So this area is relatively undeveloped. And Nunavut Territory, their most recent acquisition in terms of a territory, is left with Aboriginal people. But largely those pictures of polar bears and melting and floating ice, if you will, is when you try to picture that. And I do have a picture to show you in just a second in case you can't imagine it. The physical geography. So right here we see the Rocky Mountains. Now these are a stark difference to what we saw out of the Appalachian Mountains there with Mary's Rock. Now you may see when you picture a mountain, you may picture something more along the lines of this. Now when you imagine the United States and the central part of the United States, you'll picture that breadbasket, largely used for agriculture and farm fields like corn, like you can see here. And that's a picture that you can copy and paste and put in a variety of different states, whether it be Iowa, Ohio, Nebraska, and many other states that are characterized by this type of imagery. Here we have a picture right from Florida, a local picture. But this shows that the southeastern part of the United States is a low-lying area. The southeastern part of the United States is a relatively wet region. But you know, east of the Appalachian Mountains, we do have along the eastern seaboard that does follow around into the Gulf of Mexico is quite a low-lying area. And we'll talk about more of that in terms of the obstacles that those areas face and more. Now this country is quite different. Those first couple pictures didn't just capture the United States, nor will 4 more capture the United States. But just to show the wide range of pictures that one can take in this country of the different geography and environment and physical characteristics of the earth. Here you got the Grand Canyon in the southwestern portion of the United States in Arizona. Mammoth Caves. Now Mammoth Caves is a park in the United States in Kentucky. There's 400 miles of discovered area of a cave, and that's the largest discovered or largest known cave system in the entire world. We got that right in Kentucky. Who would have thought that Kentucky has something that is a tourist destination or something that people can flock to, people can understand. I've had an experience in there. I've gotten to check it out. Not too fond of it. Don't really like caves or confined spaces. The redwood forests and sequoia trees up in our American Northwest, and a lava flow here from the park in Hawaii, on the large island of Hawaii, the main island of Hawaii, where there's still volcanic activity. Here's some pictures I showed from Canada, because this isn't all just about the United States. And we have Montmorency Falls here in Quebec. Nunavut territory, or I said you'd imagine maybe a polar bear and some floating ice. Now you can picture it. More of the Canadian Rockies that you'll see as that continues upward. And lastly, plains here in Manitoba, which I said you could just copy and paste this picture to a lot of different areas. It's a pretty generic photo. Not to be negative on those states that that's the only thing that they have there, but that is their claim to fame. Now the Great Lakes portion of the United States I think is kind of interesting to talk about because 10 to 25,000 years ago, the Great Lakes were formed by large glaciers that were slowly moving across this region. Sometimes these glaciers were 2 miles thick, so it's been said. So that's pretty amazing. And now the Great Lakes, when you picture the Great Lakes, again, you can envision something like Lake Michigan here, a scene from Chicago, or you could picture something like this from Lake Huron up in the north, where it's a little bit more rural. Nevertheless, these are the 5 Great Lakes, and they captured 21% of the entire world's fresh water source. This is pretty amazing that we have on the United States and Canadian border. Now the climate of the United States. It's all about that because people are trying to move around and seek different climates, seek climates that are conducive to agriculture like the Midwest and places that are like Florida or what have you. Now the southeastern part of the United States is largely humid subtropical, and that's characterized by that light green color. And now you have humid continental, which is largely in the Midwest and the New England states, the Mid-Atlantic. And then you have a variety of different climates going on when you get into the western part of the United States. You have a variety of Mediterranean climate, hot deserts in the American Southwest, and again, these go in with certain populations settled there for a variety of different reasons. Certain economies exist in these places because of the climate. Certain people visit there because of the climate. So climate's obviously an important part of any society. It's an important part of the United States. It's why Florida can have a tourist industry. It's why maybe perhaps another state like Iowa isn't exactly counting on tourists to come for the climate. You can see here for Canada, the climate, it does follow a very, again, a very similar pattern in the sense that if you would continue on with this climate in terms of the oceanic climates on the Pacific West Coast up here in the north, but then you would see that there was this similar semi-arid, drier area here, and then it slowly moves into the subarctic and tundra climate as you move up into Canada, which is, again, why I said most of the Canadian population lives within a certain mileage of that of the United States, not just because they're closely linked with the United States and that they're our friends and that they love us so much. It's because they're really not so thrilled to live elsewhere in Canada just based on that climate and based on the geography. So we do have low-lying areas in the United States, like we talked about this image here from New Orleans. And climate, rainfall, we'll talk about that, our susceptibility to climate change in a coming slide. But these low-lying areas do experience storms, which we'll also be diving deeper into later. But flooding can be an issue in terms of the United States, the southeastern part of the United States being relatively warm and wet, all things considered, the eastern United States being wetter than the western part of the United States. And one of the things it's important to note in terms of climate is that the temperatures are relatively stable near the coast, and that's helping to be regulated by ocean currents and other climatic features. And the further you move into the interior, the larger variability you'll see in terms of temperature. Fargo, North Dakota is an example that some people like to use because they do experience extremes, hot temperatures in the summer and very cold temperatures in the winter. Here is an example of San Francisco temperatures, highs and lows and the U.S. average. And you can see the U.S. average operates in terms of a bell curve, whereas the daily high and daily low doesn't really fluctuate much in a city like San Francisco, which is on the water and on the coast. Now, environment. We've been talking about this, but in terms of its relation with climate and with the physical geography, but North America has the highest rate of greenhouse gas emission per capita. And you know, that's on us, that's on our type of society that we've come to know, and we've come to accept. However, there obviously is a change, and we will be talking more about that when we get into the human component of this section. But patterns of urbanization have created sprawl and high demand for automobiles in this country, largely because the automobile industry in the United States is strong. It does have a strong lobby, and it does employ lots and lots of workers. So it's not a problem to be car friendly in that sense of things. But in terms of our ecological footprint, automobile use is heavy on fossil fuel use, therefore on greenhouse gas emissions. But what we mean by sprawl is that the urbanization is continuing to move further and further from city centers, and that's because largely a movement after World War II as these folks get back from war, and others just in a general movement. When we think of the American dream, we're thinking white picket fence and the little yard and these types of things. And everybody needs their little bit of property. So people began to move from the city center and created suburbia, where you'll see a relatively cookie cutter houses and neighborhoods, and everybody has their little yard. However, that spread everything out, and that has created a problem with commuting and traffic. It's created a problem with greenhouse gas emissions, because the longer you run your car, the more greenhouse gas emissions you have. And it's really spiraled into the case of where we see it right now in this country. Seen here from Los Angeles over Thanksgiving time, folks trying to get to the airport last minute, Carmageddon, if you will. That's I can't claim that that nice term, but then again, it's seen here with just terrible traffic. I can't even think about what I would do if I was sitting in that. Probably safe to say I wouldn't be even trying to make my flight. Be making different plans by that point. Now, vulnerability to climate change in the United States varies according to different areas. Obviously, places like Nebraska and Iowa, who, like we said before, agricultural areas, they wouldn't have that typical vulnerability to climate change like we would imagine with sea level rise and coastal erosion. Now, it is estimated that soils are continuing to dry as a result of as climate change and different temperature patterns. So we are seeing a greater demand for irrigation through agriculture. And so these places are also still vulnerable to climate change, but in a different way. And when we think of climate change in this country, we think, probably because we're here in Florida right now, we think of a sea level rise and perhaps coastal erosion, like you'd see here, a photo from Oregon, where the coast is disappearing, eroding, and some houses are facing a tough time. And in parts of California, there's some mudslides happening right now, and so these are, obviously can't blame them all on climate change, but we can certainly attribute these to human environmental problems that we face in this country, no matter where we are. But mostly we think of sea level rise. And this photo here is from this little video that I'd like you to take a look at from the community of Isla de Jean Charles in Louisiana, southern Louisiana, facing increased sea level rise. And that's due to a variety of forces, but climate change is the main culprit of this. And these are our first environmental refugees in the continental United States. Continental United States being the 48 contiguous United States, where we have then Alaska and Hawaii is off in a distance. Take a look at that little video about how we're handling that situation as a country, as a nation, and it's quite disturbing, quite unfortunate. But only, not to be bearer of bad news, but it's only going to get worse for the community here, and it's only going to get worse for coastal communities here in the United States and Canada and around the world. So buckle up. Now, air pollution and smog and acid rain are these noxious substances which get into the atmosphere, and they're put back into into precipitation that rains down onto the region. This acid rain is what I'm talking about there. There's demonstrated there through a diagram. Smog, obviously, in urban areas where Los Angeles has a smog problem, other developed parts of the world have smog problems. Typically, the old economic core in this country used to have a smog problem. That's cleared up when industry ceased. But eastern United States and southeastern Canada are most impacted by acid rain due to the climate and human activity. Water depletion and pollution. Now, this is a pretty fascinating thing, if I do say so myself. But the Ogallala Aquifer is an underground water reserve. that touches 8 states and largest in North America. And it's why agriculture is booming in the Midwest and Century Part of the United States, because even though that soil is drying out, and sometimes they're not getting constant rainfall, they just pull it up from underground. However, it's unsustainable to the amount that we've used this aquifer dating back many, many decades. And lastly, on terms of the pollution side, is that 40% of U.S. rivers are not safe for recreation in the sense of swimming or fishing. A more recently discovered pollutant is that of antibiotics, which is getting into the fish supply and making things a bit dangerous for human consumption. Now, local water depletion. We talked about this when I was talking to you from Chattahoochee, Florida, right on the border where the Apalachicola and the Chattahoochee meet. And that's part of the ACF basin where you can finally visualize this rather than being on the bank of a river. But I was nearby Lake Seminole talking about this problem from the ACF basin, and there you can see the ACT basin off to the other side. And again, put things into perspective, Lake Lanier north of Atlanta, and Atlanta, sort of the culprit. I don't want to cast any blame, but Atlanta, they're to blame. They're continuing to sprawl, continuing to grow like a major city would. However, they are maxing out their water resources, and they're continually needing and requesting more. The Army Corps of Engineers is regulating this water, and therefore this water diversion that's depriving the Apalachicola River and the Apalachicola Bay of fresh water. It's hurting our shellfish industry here in Florida. It's hurting the folks in Alabama who want to use this water for whatever means they deem or seem to fit. And actually, it's been ruled that the United States Supreme Court will likely hear this case. So we'll have to stay tuned for that, whether it comes during the course of this class or a following course. But stay tuned on that if you think this is kind of interesting. I think it's very interesting. But then again, I'm here doing this, and I have to kind of say that. But it's true. Now, urban sprawl, I already talked about sprawl, and here's urban sprawl, which is the encroachment of these suburbs, those cookie-cutter houses that you saw on a slide a few slides ago. They're encroaching on agricultural land. And this is a problem in some areas because it's more difficult to get food production there that's locally sourced, and it's more intense on the energy and things like that. Now, forest fragmentation isn't so hot either in terms of an ecological standpoint. Breaking up of large contiguous forests into these parsed out areas and smaller pieces are not good for the environment, of course. And from even a human health standpoint, when you have forest fragmentation such as this, your interactions with animals, certain types of animals could even increase, and you see forest fragmentation in some parts of the country even leads to increased Lyme disease cases because of the interaction and with the ticks, which is a vector that transmits Lyme disease. And so it's a vector-borne disease in the United States. And so forest fragmentation, not good for the local environment long term. It's not good for human health, although that's just one component of a whole other host of why forest fragmentation isn't good. Just one example. Fossil fuels. Now, drilling and pipelines have profound impact on the environment. It probably doesn't take me to tell you that drilling probably isn't good for the earth. Now, going back to April 2010, not sure if that means anything to you. I don't know what you were doing back in April 2010, but I remember this because when I was in class, they had to talk about it every day. It was a big deal. And that was because 200 million gallons of oil was leaked into the Gulf of Mexico because of the Deepwater Horizon. There was an explosion. It was leased by BP, and we had a major oil spill here off the coast of the United States, here in the Gulf Coast, and had a profound environmental impact, as you could imagine. Now, pipelines continue to leak across the United States and across the world, and we always have spills occurring. A lot of spills never even make the news because they're so commonplace or they're perceived as small. And so we have to continue to curb our fossil fuel use if we do want to have a positive impacts on our environment to sort of correct the damage that's been done. And that goes for fracking, which is a drilling technology that uses high pressure and it injects this water into the rock formations to withdraw natural gas and oil. This is more energy intensive, so it's not exactly a great practice. And the mountaintop removal, whew, okay, it's not good for the local environment either. Now, shouldn't have to, again, say that, but I'm saying it because we need to be clear. Now, mountaintop removal, particularly damaging because coal mining is bad for the environment, okay? It does provide a lot of jobs. From an economic standpoint, maybe we wouldn't say that it's so negative. But when we're going to talk from the environmental perspective, because if you remember, we are in the environment subsection here in the class. So we're going to say in this section, coal is not so great because it is not great for the environment. However, it's a form of strip mining the coal where you literally are removing the top of a mountain to get at that coal and you're pushing it down into a valley, and that garbage, if you will, that leftover is called tailings. And you can imagine what happens when you just push that down into a valley. It doesn't have any positive effects. It has a problem with it. It creates problems for the local watershed, and it does totally revamp that local topography and that natural environment. Human patterns over time. Now, I included this section by popular demand because a lot of people like to know the origins or the history of this region, particularly because it's our region, because we're coming from that of the United States. It's a little bit more history focused, which is why I typically don't like to talk too much about this, because we are a geography class that's happening in the now. But we will talk about this section because it is important to us as this does shape our local context and our history in that of our country, the United States. So original settlers of North America, due to domestication of plants and animals, settlements began to grow in the United States. 1,000 years ago, there was a settlement of Cahokia in Illinois, and a population that exceeded 30,000 people. So this is where you can finally start to see these large settlements and people gathering. You had trade happening, and that's not to say that these things weren't happening before, but these large settlements have sort of begun to happen at this time, or at least so we recognize according to our textbook. Now, at one point there was a relatively high amount of Native Americans and Aboriginal peoples. Aboriginal peoples were referred to typically those in Canada, Native Americans, those in the United States of America. At one point, about 18 million in 1492 before Europeans found us. And that number was diminished to only about 400,000 in 1907. Since then, there's been a rebound in their population. However, profound impact of European colonization here in the United States and Canada and North America. That loss of Native Americans, Aboriginal peoples was a result of disease and overt violence. So when we talk about how this country got settled in terms of the United States, we'll talk about southern settlements, and that European settlements in the United States began in the south, began not far from here, from the Spanish. And from there were settlements that, by the British, 1607 in the state of Virginia now, Commonwealth of Virginia. And then things began to change after those settlements of Florida and Virginia. In 1619, things changed when enslaved Africans began to be brought to the United States. And not just the United States, but the North American region for agricultural work. As you can imagine, this had a profound impact on the local population, on the populations in which they came. But the South remains the poorest subregion in North America, tracing back to that plantation agriculture. And as we know, here in the United States and around the world, economies that are based largely around agriculture are just simply not as competitive as those that are more diversified. So that history of the South does remain with it in terms of its underdevelopment and its poor economy in relation to other regions here in the United States. So this one is a lot going on here because this is the northern settlements, the Mid-Atlantic settlements, the Great Plains settlements. I just simply didn't think there was enough going into multiple parts of each, because we will talk about that in a more contemporary sense But timber, animal pelts, fishing were the main exports of the northern settlements in the United States and the southern settlements of Canada, and what we would figure the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast right now, New England. Now the Mid-Atlantic colonies eventually surpassed New England and southern Canada in terms of population and both wealth, and it's why we now refer to that region as the Old Economic Core. Great Plains, again, that breadbasket term, they became our agricultural hub, or our agricultural center due to the favorable environmental conditions. However, like I said before, there wasn't consistent rainfall, and so before there was this widespread mechanization of irrigation, they did experience problems in the 1930s, which was the Dust Bowl, when there was droughts in the area, and you tie that into the Great Depression, and it did leave a lot of people flee the region, which then some of them did go to the Pacific Coast and the American Southwest. Now, westward settlers sometimes skipped over the Great Plains completely, never even took part in what was the Dust Bowl or other things going on in the center part of the United States. And they went directly to California because in 1848 there was a gold rush that lasted the 1850s. And so that's what helped develop the Pacific Coast and California and the West Coast. But from the gold rush, some settlers decided to move north into the logging industry up in the Pacific Northwest. And that pretty much takes care of that early colonization of the Pacific Coast. And then lastly, the American Southwest, which was again by the Spanish from Mexico in the 1500s, and eventually became a productive region for agriculture. And still to this day, because not only is it a dry, hot desert, there's also that Mediterranean climate as you move towards the Pacific Coast. Sort of sum up this European settlement and the interactions between American Indians, Native Americans, and Aboriginal peoples was the forcible relocation and movement of Native Americans, and that was commonplace at this point in time in the United States. And one notable example is, perhaps you've heard of it, is the Trail of Tears, and that was the forcible relocation of a variety of tribes, nations, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee peoples, where they were forcibly moved to Oklahoma from the American Southeast. And 4,000 Native Americans passed away on their journey, which is why it was known as the Trail of Tears, a stain on our American history. Control of the land greatly differs between the United States and Canada, however. Where in the United States, indigenous peoples, Native Americans, only control that of 2% of the land. At 20% is the norm in Canada, and that's largely because some of those territories have control from the Nunavut territories, which is the Inuit people, and they largely control larger swaths of land up in Canada. Now in 2010, there are 6 million Native Americans in the United States and 4 million living in Canada. So you can see, like I mentioned, these communities have rebounded since European colonization. Now that completes part one of this section, North America. Stay tuned and get ready for part two.